Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 10 of Agri-Culture. I think it's 10. I don't know. I can't remember. I should have wrote that down. But today I'm talking with Chris Narayanan from Tennessee. He's the University of Tennessee's Extension Area Farm Management Specialist. And so we're going to, I think, dabble in a little bit of economics today. Something I wish, if I could go back, I always say if I could go back, I'd either go for meat science or economics. But here I am. I have a degree in animal science, and I'm working in radio. So I guess it doesn't really mean much. But yeah, Chris, give me your background in ag. Did you grow up in agriculture? How did you choose a career in this line of work? Yeah, let's just start from there.
Yeah, so I grew up around it. Not my family, but some friends. Grew up around horses and the cattle industry a little bit, and so I would help out when I could, and just kind of fell in love with the space. And I said, you know what, when I get to college, I want to study agriculture. I actually started off as an animal science major, had all the intentions in the world to go to vet school, but turns out I wasn't very good at science. So economics made a lot more sense. So I got a degree in ag econ and then just kind of went from there.
Yeah, I think economics in general is so – I wish it was more of a priority in our school system in general. I mean, if you don't understand economics, it's pretty hard to understand just how the world works in general when it comes to business especially. But I think it's so important, and it's a little bit underrated. But did you always want a career in ag and ag econ? Was that always your plan? Or, I mean, I know you said you wanted to go to vet school, but did you have other endeavors that you ever contemplated?
Well, no. I mean, I think by the time I got to college, I was pretty much set it was going to be an ag. I was just trying to figure out what the best way of doing it. And when I got out of the Marines, I went right back into agriculture. So that was an easy transition. I had a couple of ag degrees by then. And then I kind of took a interesting route. I noticed this would have been, I guess, in the mid-2000s that Wall Street was getting more into agriculture. I'm like, well, what do they know about it? But 2 ag degrees is not going to give you a whole lot of clout when you're competing with MBAs and people like that. So I ended up getting my MBA on the weekends and made that transition. And I lived I worked in the community for about 15 years. Lived in New York for about 7 of those.
Oh wow!
And so where I was as a commodities analyst, as a stock analyst, and then as an investment banker. And so, but all agribusiness or at least commodity focused throughout that time. So gave me an interesting kind of outlook or just a different way of looking at the industry, probably in ways that most people don't. But then I think it also helped me because I was able to understand things in a different way and maybe bring that back to the farm level and say, okay, this is why this is important and this is how that works and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Just you mentioning having that perspective, like from the economic perspective, I've noticed, especially in the last year or so, there's maybe a bit of a lack of understanding when it comes to economics, especially in the livestock industry. And so, yeah, it would be helpful, again, if people just kind of understood some of the basic principles of economics, because it's easy to go into conspiracy land when we might not understand something completely. But let's just kind of get into what we planned on talking about today. So what are the biggest modern challenges when it comes to marketing livestock as well as crops? In your opinion?
I think it's not even a modern challenge. I think it's been that way for quite some time. I think it's just the education level. And I'm not just talking about producers. I'm talking about bankers as well, the community bankers and the like, because you had your crop. Let's just say you sell futures, whether it's feeder cattle or corn or beans or whatever. If you've got to have the capital behind it, the working capital to meet those margin calls if it moves one way or the other. I mean, I think conceptually most people now understand that cash and futures tend to move together. That difference in the rate of movement is the basis. And so if you are selling futures now, say for September delivery, and between now and September it might go down, so then you buy it back at a lower price. But between now and September it might go up a few times and move against you, in which case the exchanges and the brokers are going to want to have more margin money back, put back into it. And I think that scares a lot of people. And I think it kind of pushes them to options, where you have the right but not the obligation. So if you buy a put, you could sell futures if you wanted to at some point when that time comes to exercise that put. Or you can just pay for it and just say, I don't need it or I don't want to do it. And you just lose your premium, kind of like insurance, where you don't, you have that premium paid. And then if you need it, you use it. If not, then it just goes away. But I think it's the education of being able to understand. And then to be fair, though, I mean, it's also just a cash flow constraint. It's not that necessarily they don't understand it. It scares them. It is a big ask, and things can get, if you get a very volatile market, you can run out of cash very quickly. And I think trying to figure out how to best manage the risk of managing risk, if you will,
right,
it's still a challenge.
So where does hedging fit into all of this? I know a minute amount about it. Okay. I think I listened to a podcast once about it, and it was a guy actually trying to push producers to hedge their livestock, which I don't know if I just never heard of that before, or if it's not very common. But how does that fit into the picture that you're speaking of?
Well, I mean, if that's a great example on livestock, because let's just say you're a cattle producer and you are, you got a cow-calf, operator, and, you're going to sell them at weaning, or maybe you'll grow them on grass for a couple of months and then send them to a feedlot as feeder cattle. How do you manage that risk? And I remember back in the 90s, they tried doing a stocker cattle contract because cow-calf guys didn't really have any one-for-one kind of ways to hedge. I mean, they had a feeder cattle contract, but that's heavier, older calves, not the ones coming off their mom. And that it just didn't get the liquidity and the interest in it. So then all you had to use was a feeder cattle. But then there's going to be a price differential, not only in the cash market, but also in the futures, because you talk about load sizes and stuff like that. You're in a place like Texas, where you have more cattle than people. It's a lot easier to get a load, a truckload. But if you're, here in West Tennessee, when you're running 30 mama cows, let's just say, it's really, I mean, unless you start commingling with other folks, your neighbors and not, it's really hard to get a full load, 50,000 pounds worth of animals together a lot of times. So it makes the hedging very difficult, because you don't want to take on more risk by managing your risk, by over hedging or under hedging or whatever. Right.
Yeah, this stuff is fascinating to me. So I sent you a quote though, and I can't remember. It was an econ guy that had, I think it's a livestock guy, that he put this on Twitter, but it said, a producer will do anything to fix a problem except math. Can you relate to that in your field? Is that something, or?
I wouldn't even pick on producers. I think it's, most people, unless you just love math, or
I will do anything, but I swear I have dyslexia when I see numbers. I see numbers and I start to sweat and I panic.
and I'm reading a book that talks about that, where people give, you just give them like, what's 17 times 24? And if you start trying to do that in your head, your heart starts racing and your eyes get big like that, and, and everything else. So I think that's a normal reaction, unless you're just in a situation or an education where you just have that affinity. Like I did a farm visit last week, up here in Northwest Tennessee, and the son who now took over the farm, he actually studied accounting in college. So he was, it was really easy, because he was doing the math in his head, and we could, talk the same language, versus somebody that's never, they specifically wants folks like us to help them, because they just don't know where to start. Right. I mean, and the math isn't, we're not talking about like calculus 3 here. I mean, it's arithmetic, and maybe a little bit of algebra, but it's still, if you're not used to doing it, I think it can just make, be a little overbearing for some folks.
Yeah, it's definitely intimidating. Do you have some specific routes that farmers can take to mitigate their risk when it comes to, like, specifically crop production?
Yeah, I would say, whether it's crop or livestock, the first thing you need to do is get a good handle on your financials. Put a balance sheet together, figure out what assets you own, what liabilities, so loans and whatnot that you've got, and then the difference between those two is your net worth. You want to get a good kind of snapshot of where you sit financially, what your financial health check looks like. From there, I think you have to have an enterprise budget, for everything that you're doing. So one for soybeans, another one for corn, or maybe you're, growing winter wheat and you're raising, a cow-calf operation. And so you want to have budgets for each one of those. And then if one ties into the other, then we can help you put it all together and make it, where one feeds into the other. Like, just say you're doing a little bit of wheat feeding or, on the pasture or something like that, turn them out on wheat pasture for a little bit. And so I think those are the first, before you start talking about hedging or forward contracting or anything like that, I think you really just need to sit down and get those numbers, or find somebody that can help do that for you. And that's a lot of what we do in extension is, a good portion of my business, not my business, but my job is to, we'll sit down at the kitchen table. I got my laptop open and I've got a program that we use, and then we also have some spreadsheets that we can use to kind of hone in on, a person's individual operation, but really give them a good, idea of where they sit financially and where we can start planning ahead. Right. And then from there, then you can start talking about things like, all right, well, what if I, shift my acres, more acres of this, less acres of that, or maybe I get out of this business, or maybe, hey, you know what, maybe I should expand my herd, or, whatever that looks like. And then once you've done that initial legwork, you're a lot more prepared to be able to actually do some of that work. And then you can start talking about, okay, well, do I hedge? Is it selling futures? Is it buying options? Is it something more sophisticated than that? Or maybe it's forward contracting or a hedge to arrive contract or something like that, where you sell futures, but or you fix the futures price with the elevator, but then you price the bases out later, depending on everything, and understanding market movements and the historical, movement of prices and why things move. So, but I think, before you start looking at anything like that, you really need to sit down and get your financials in order to, and be able to understand where your bottlenecks are and where you're making money and losing money, and then come up with a custom tailored solution to manage risk or anything else that you want to do.
Definitely. So, obviously solidify the basics and go from there.
Exactly.
Yeah. So coming back to resources for farmers to do this kind of thing. I mean, besides a guy like yourself that they can call up, and be like, what do I do? Are there other resources that you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the state. I mean, in Tennessee, we've got 7 folks, including myself, that do what I do, what we call the managed program, where we're farm management specialists. I think we're supposed to have 9, so hopefully later this year we'll be fully staffed. And then you have extension economists and other, like in Texas, for example. And so you can start with the extension service, or even starting with your county agent, say, hey, is there an economist, whether it's at that land grant university, or somebody in the area that can help me talk through that. And of course, there's plenty of private organizations. There's brokers out there. There's market analysts. There's newsletters, and, to where you can start educating yourself on the market or keeping track of the trends. I don't think there's any real shortage of folks that are involved. It's just in what capacity and where their expertise lies.
Right. And it's kind of knowing where to look too, maybe a little bit. So I mentioned to you you're familiar with the Bushel app?
A little bit.
Okay. So is that something that you like, that you would recommend to people when it comes to mitigating risk, or do you stray away from that type of thing? I mean, what's your thought on those types of apps?
To be fair, I mean, I've dug around their website, but I've never I've never demoed it or anything like that. So I really can't comment, whether I would actually use it or not, because I'm familiar with who they are and the services that they provide. But I would say more conceptually, anything that you can do, any kind of technology, or basically anything that you're not doing by hand, you should be using it because it makes you more efficient, and it, you can do things faster and just use that, the time that you save for something else, right? So you still have to have that basic understanding of what goes behind the scenes, whether it's an app or, just looking at a chart of prices. What am I looking at here? Because, I've seen too many people buy the latest and greatest thing of whatever, and they don't really know how to use it. It's kind of like, hey, I know I need to I got a tree that fell down on this property. I know I need to use a chainsaw to be able to do it. It'll be faster than me taking an axe. But if you don't know how to use a chainsaw, it's not going to be and in some cases, be very dangerous.
Yeah, it's a good analogy.
Exactly. And the same thing when it comes to financial tools. If you don't know what you're doing, if you don't understand what goes behind the scenes, you can actually do more harm than good. So I would say, there's plenty of stuff out there that works really well, but I would caution folks to make sure you understand what it's trying to do and how it helps you do it in a way that makes you more efficient, or better manage your risk, or whatever that is.
Right. And so, do you have a different approach when it comes to livestock producers, when talking mitigating risk, or that type of thing? Just kind of the same questions I'm asking, but separate.
Right. I don't think I would really stray. The only difference would be just what you're talking, the underlying. So you have to understand the cattle markets and, or hogs or whatever we're talking about. But the same basic principles apply, right? You need to know your cost of production. You need to know your break evens. You need to know what tools are out there. And for livestock, is a little bit different. It's not as easy to get those loads like I talked about earlier. And so being able to, you want to make sure that what tools that you have don't introduce more risk, because you've overhedged or something like that, right? Or you don't quite understand what you're doing. But then there's things like forward contracting, right? So there's still risk in that, because there's production risk. And depending on how that contract is written, you can get, dinged pretty hard if you don't deliver, right? But on the flip side, you have someone that's buying from you that's expecting, because they've got folks that they're answering to, right? So, I think, when you look at stuff like this, you have to be very realistic, and that's where record keeping, I think, is really important, especially in livestock. I know data is the big buzzword now, but livestock producers, we've been doing the cattle industry for years, right? EPDs and all that, because we want to know, what we're producing and how we can get better at doing it, right? So this isn't new. The only thing that's new now is maybe the tools that we're using. Instead of pen and paper or a calculator or a spreadsheet, now we're using apps, right? But it's the same numbers that are coming through in the end.
Right. So I'm more of a livestock gal myself, and I know that the cattle industry is very cyclical. We go up and we go down all the time, and then we like to argue about it. Is it like that in the crop industry as well?
It is, but it's not as pronounced, I think, because you have an annual crop. And so you can make adjustments a little bit quicker. If you think about the cattle cycle, for example, right? About 9 months for pregnancy, you wean them at 4 months, put them on grass for another 2 months, and then in the feed yard for 6 months. We're talking 2 years by then, right? So it's trying to, you can't stop it. Now, take poultry, for example. Chickens, 45 days. They can switch on a dime, right? Hogs, I think the life cycle is about 8 months or something like that. So, the cattle industry it's cyclical and more pronounced because of that biological lags. And that's one of the reasons why it gets pretty challenging to manage risk sometimes, because you can't just cut back production on a whim. It's not like a grain farmer said, okay, you know what, I'm going to cut back on the acres that I plant next year because the price isn't quite there, and I might switch to something else that, has a higher projected yield or return or whatever it is.
Yeah, cattle production is quite literally a different animal when you're comparing it to, it's not a good one, please. But when you compare it to like swine and poultry, because those are pretty vertically integrated as well.
Right.
And we have to do that with cattle, I think, because we have such a variation when it comes to frame sizes, breeds. We got this and that, a little bit of that. It's a little bit more difficult. But I had mentioned in some of my questions direct marketing.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of producers are considering that pretty heavily after the pandemic and that break in the food chain that we saw. So not all producers are equipped to finish cattle though. So are there options for small as well as large producers to mitigate risk? Do they do it differently? And you mentioned that a little bit earlier, but is it do you have the same approach or?
Yeah, with a few caveats. Because managing risk is more than just forward contracting or futures and options. It's also managing your supply chain and everything else, right? So, for example, out here in Tennessee, freezer beef has been, very, very popular, because people realize that, hey, you know what? I don't have the economies of scale to produce, enough of a pen at a feedlot, but I can sell to my neighbor or whatever. The problem is, especially what the pandemic has shown, is those processing plants get backed up. You might not have a kill day for another year and a half in some cases. And so part of their risk management is All right. So and then you have the, actually, let me take a step back. So you also have the regulations, with food and everything else. So when it comes to, inspections, you can't, unless you're a USDA, regulated facility, you can sell on the hoof, but you can't sell, freezer cuts of beef, right? So,
Right.
for example, I'm going to sell you a steer at say, 1,000 pounds, let's just say, because I'm finishing it on grass, and that's what you wanted. You come get it, or I can deliver it to a processing plant, but you've paid me on the hoof, and then you pay the processor whatever it is for them to harvest the animal, and then you collect your meat and you go, right? But what if you come over and say, okay, well, here you go, here's this calf, and good luck to you, and you're like, okay, what am I supposed to do with it?
Right.
Well, I don't have any kill dates, I don't know anybody, and then all of a sudden you're not going to come back to see me next year because you're like, I don't want to put this in my backyard for the next, till I can find a kill date. So I think part of that is managing risk, and that's what I mean by it's more than just futures and options. I mean, I've got producers out here that have booked kill dates a year and a half in advance because they know that on their breeding cycle that they'll have so many head that'll be ready by that point, and they have it locked in already. And so I think there's, things stuff like that people don't always think about, saying, hey, this sounds great because I can get a premium on it. I can get more for my, per pound than, maybe somebody would be at the store or whatever. And I can sell the entire animal, or maybe sell halves or even quarters, depending on what the demand looks like. But you still have to be able to have that kill date. If you don't, then somebody's going to be stuck with a live animal and they're not going to be too happy.
Yeah. Economies of scale to me is a major reason why the packing industry has become so condensed. And that makes sense to me. But then, like I said, we saw that breaker, in the supply chain, and not a beef shortage. It was just that we didn't have the capacity to slaughter animals. So, gosh, where was I going with this? So now, like the direct marketing, consumers purchasing directly from producers, that is blowing up right now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that is just a short-term response that's going to kind of peter off, or do you think it's going to, consumers are going to be consistent, and this is going to catch on even further, and it's going to be prevalent in our industry now, that direct-to-consumer marketing? What do you think?
Well, barring any supply chain major constraints that we talked about, I think we live in an urban country anymore. Most people are far removed from their food source, and they like, but they don't, and so ignorance can breed fear, right? Because
Absolutely.
Ignorance is not stupidity; it's just they just don't know, right? I mean, and so there's a huge segment of the population, and it seems to get bigger every year, that wants to know where the food is coming from.
They do not know what they don't know.
Right.
That's even worse to me, because you don't even, you know what I mean?
Right. And I mean, like you and I, we'd be like, why would you buy a grass-fed ribeye? Because the whole point of a ribeye is the marbling, and you're not going to get as much marbling on when it's grass-finished, I should say. I hate the term grass-fed because every calves are fed on grass. It's just not. Some are finished on grass and some are not. But but even things like that, right? Grass-fed beef. Well, you show me a head of cattle that's not fed grass at some point in their life, right? And so because of things, buzzwords and things, I think and you have the proliferation of farmers markets and everything else, and then not just in the meat, but it's produce and it's fruits and it's everything else, honey and everything else. There is something to be said about locally grown, locally made, and there is a premium that's attached to it. Yeah. Now, from a economies of scale, like you mentioned earlier, standpoint, is that sustainable? Probably not. I think it'll be very localized. But having said that, if you have enough folks in that local area to provide for that local area, then instead of having these large-scale operations that's feeding an entire country, you have these little pockets around the country that are feeding just their local area, right? And so I think there's room for both, to be honest. But you're going to have your, I don't think unless we really do figure out how to not just grow meat in a petri dish, but grow whole animals in the same way, to be able to feed everybody. I think that's going to take some time, but I think there's definitely room, and we've seen it. I work with producers that do that, and supply their local market. I've got friends that do it as well in other parts of the country, and they've been very successful. I don't see that changing. I think it's just more the how, is it going to get too saturated and all of a sudden you lose that premium advantage?
Yeah. We definitely live in a country of convenience, and we definitely have the privilege of food choice. I think as Americans, we take that for granted, living in the first world country that we do. So it's just interesting to me is that after the pandemic and that hitting, and now everyone wants to buy local, support your local farmers. To me, whether you go to the guy next door or you go to the grocery store, you're still supporting local farmers, because 98% of farms are family owned, and that's always a concern for people as well. They don't want to support corporate farms or this and that, and it's like, well, just because it's a big operation doesn't mean it's just or it's still a family-owned operation. And I just like to clear some of those things up every now and then, because I know we have listeners that didn't grow up in agriculture firsthand. So yeah, let's switch over to ag tech. I really like to talk about the communication gap between producers and consumers. But even within our own industry, we have a bit of communication problem of sorts. Or should I say maybe like a negative outlook on adopting new production methods or something new, like my dad, I might bring up, and I don't do this anymore because I know better, but I'll bring up an idea, and I'm sure anybody else my age, or maybe you're familiar with it as well, but they just shoot it down, no, we've always done things this way. So, what are your thoughts on that? Like, as an industry, do you think we're kind of like that? I would say so.
I think we are a little reluctant to try new things, but I would argue it's for a different reason. Think about it, especially at the producer level of agriculture, margins can get very thin, right? So when you're asking folks to spend more money, immediately you're like, whoa, why, right? So I think, when you look at the new technology, and
you spend money to make money, right?
Well, you do, but at the same time, you don't want to, but you got to make sure that what you're spending, the returns are there too, right? Because, all right, I'm going to spend X amount of dollars that I normally wouldn't on this new technology, whatever that looks like. Well, how's it going to increase my revenue? How's it going to decrease my costs? Or ideally both over the long run, right? And it may not be, in the first year, but, show me something. And I think when ag tech first became like the buzzword, I think you had a lot of smart computer, and technology type folks out in San Francisco and other, places like that, where what I call the Kevin Costner Field of Dreams approach, where if we build it, they will come, right? And unfortunately, that's not the case because, like I said, reducing costs, increasing revenue, hopefully both. If you can't make that, if you can't communicate that to a producer, why would they spend $15,000 on this new computer system to put on their center pivot, right? That's going to allow them to do whatever or these sensors or whatever it is, right? But then, ag tech started shifting, places like St. Louis, right there in the heart of the Midwest. You had a bunch of smart farm kids that either got degrees in technological degrees or hired the right folks, but they came from the farm. And so instead of solutions looking for problems, all of a sudden now you started seeing more problems that were getting solved, right? Because they knew firsthand these are some of the issues we have on the farm, and let's try to solve. Let's go that way. And I think that has worked out a lot better in recent years, and I've definitely been more impressed with the developments in ag tech. But I think really when it comes down to the farm level, the fact is you got to remember that these margins are pretty thin, and it goes back to what when you brought up that app. Is this something you want to make sure that what you're using, you understand what it's doing, and it doesn't introduce more risk in it, maybe in what you're doing, or maybe something that you didn't even see coming. Because now all of a sudden it takes your focus away from something, and you get blindsided in the end. So I think it's part of it is just they just don't understand, but part of it is also the fact that you don't want to spend money unnecessarily. So you really have that's really up to the companies to show why where that return is going to come from.
Yeah. So along the lines of Bushel again, I don't mean to pick on them. It's just there's other apps like those, but when I was in NAMA, National Ag Marketing Association, we had to recreate our own version of that app.
Mhm.
And so we had to go through the process of, what's it going to look like? What's it going to cost? How, what are going to be the issues that are going to arise when we are trying to get producers to adopt this technology? And we kind of figured out that it was just show them how to use it, and then it won't be a problem. So maybe that's just it. You just got to show them how to do it, and then away they go. But so I'm guessing that you're an advocate for ag tech, like.
No, I mean, I'm an advocate for anything that's going to make life easier for producers
Yeah.
without placing undue burden or risk on them, right? So, technology is such a broad word, and I know like now technology means an app on a phone. When people think technology, but there's a lot more to it, right? There's sensors, there's soil sensors. I remember when auto steer came out on the tractors and GPS and everything else, right? That's technology.
Yeah.
And I think
they don't do anything anymore. They just get in their tractor and go.
Yeah.
It's me as the livestock girl talking.
Well, you know what? Plane's been that way for years, right? How many pilots? I mean, they're there to make sure if something goes wrong that they can take care of it, right? And so, but then again, look how many people are pushing calves now with 4-wheelers. That's technology too, right?
Should we talk about that?
No, because I've done it too. So I mean,
yeah. I'll just say I don't agree with it.
and so it's. Technology can be used. I remember, speaking of technology, here's an old story. There was this old boy that I was talking to. He must have, this was probably about a decade ago, and he must have been about 80 years old at the time. And I was like, sir, what was the best technological advance you've seen? And he'd been farming his entire life. He's like, when they put air conditioning in tractors. He's like, because then I could because it used to be when it was open air, I'd get up first thing in the morning when the sun came up. By about 10 o'clock, it was way too hot. So then I came in, had an early lunch, took a nap. And then at about 3, 4 o'clock, I'd go back out there and finish up what I was doing. And it would just take longer. But now that I have enclosed cabin with AC in it, I can go all day and not have to worry about it. And I was like, you know what? That's something we take for granted. But there was a time in the 50s or whatever that they didn't, that wasn't the case, right? So I think, am I an advocate for tech? Yeah, look, I'm an advocate for agriculture and for the producers, and anything that we can do to make things more efficient, save them money, increase their revenues, I'm all for. But I think sometimes you have to be careful about the latest and greatest things, and take everything kind of like in a disciplined kind of way and say, what are you trying to accomplish by introducing this system into your operation?
Absolutely. Just to comment on the AC and the tractor thing. I'm not familiar with AC in a tractor because when I was raking hay, if I recall, I had no windows. I did have a cab, but there were no windows and there was no AC. So I don't know what this guy is talking about. But yeah, and I never got to graduate up to cutting or baling. So yeah, I just got to be raking hay all day with, But it builds character. I think everyone should rake hay in a windowless tractor, sweating their butts off. It's good for you. But so let's move on here. What do you tell folks? Like you said, people can be apprehensive about spending money. If you're advocating something to them as an extension specialist, you get some negative pushback. How do you talk them into doing this or that?
Well, I mean, I guess the short answer is delicately. Because I'm serious. Because look, at the end of the day, I'm just an advisor, right? I mean, I'm not. I'm there to help if they need it. But if they don't want the help, I'm not going to force myself, right? And so, whether it's I've got producers, they're saying, I would love to learn more about futures and options. I just don't get it. I can sit down and talk to them, and I can stay. I mean, I can go for 2 hours. I could talk for 8 hours. I mean, it's just depending on their comfort level, their time, their understanding, and what their background was beforehand, right? Or it might be in a series of. And one of the things that I want to do for extension is find another way, or look at the way we currently teach it. Maybe there's we blow it out into a seminar series or something like that where we can kind of take it step by step. And it's been done in other places in the country, and I'm looking at what other folks are doing. But I think really at the end of the day, it's just, you have to listen more than you talk. And if you start hearing, and after a while, you'll start hearing some recurring themes. It's okay, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. And then that's kind of like when you say, okay, well, look, this is why I believe that this is a problem. And these are some of the ways that you can solve that problem. But if you don't understand how that works, you shouldn't do it, because again, that goes back to, introducing risk into the system that because of things that you don't understand, right? So I think part of it is also understanding who the producer is, whether it's education or experience, levels of understanding, what their comfort level is, spending patterns, and what their financial health looks like, and do they have room? Because you'll have people, hey, can I afford to buy this piece of equipment? Well, let's run the numbers first, and then see what your cash flow needs and what other obligations you already have before we start thinking about something else, right? So whether it's a $10,000 squeeze chute, which got all the bells and whistles on it, or you just want to get some panels just to do something real quick. I think you have to run the numbers, but at the end of the day, when I have to remember that I'm an advisor, and it's not my business, it's not my operation, so I can give them my honest opinion and say, look, this is what I would do if you're in your shoes, but it's really up to you to decide if you want to do that or not.
Yeah, that's why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Is that what they say?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about regenerative agriculture. First of all, what is your definition of regenerative agriculture? I remember like a year ago, I was still in school and I was like, regenerative agriculture. I'm seeing this everywhere. People just throw it out there. They throw it out there and then it's like, what does this mean? Just a couple words.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on who you are, right? So for me, it's farming practices that in the long run are more efficient, more cost effective, better for your land, right? Yeah. For an environmentalist, it could be fighting climate change. It could be, or somebody, cleaning up groundwater, reducing runoff. And I think the best way to describe it is, I remember I have a master's in rangeland management, and we had a T-shirt back then that read "2 cowboy for the environmentalist, 2 environmentalists for the cowboy." I thought that was the best thing, and I wish I still had that shirt.
That was a good one. Yeah,
that was a long time ago, but I wish I had that. But because I think when I look at regenerative agriculture, there's a lot of stuff that's being advocated that I think makes a lot of sense from an agronomic standpoint. So, for example, putting down cover crops, red clover or whatever in the wintertime. It'll help because you don't want bare soil, so it'll help you prevent against soil erosion. Mm-hmm. It'll also fix nitrogen a little bit, so your fertilizer requirements should go down, everything else being equal, right? And so then that means it is better for the environment, but it's also cheaper for you, because especially if you've seen fertilizer prices this year have just went, ballistic. And so, if you can find ways to make yourself more cost effective, and I mean, let's face it, farmers and ranchers are the best stewards of the land because they need the land for their livelihood. If nothing else, if we stripped away everything about morality and, what's right for the world and everything, and just from a purely economic standpoint, they owe their living to that piece of land. So it's in their best interest to take care of that land for no other reason, because otherwise they're going to be out of business, right? So, and then you can put the other stuff in there. Okay, you know what? I don't want runoff into my neighbor's property or something like that, or I don't want that stream getting dirty and infecting kids when they're swimming or whatever, right? So you have all the other stuff along with it. But then it's practices like no-till, which I mean when people first start talking about no-till, like, oh, it's never going to work, and you see how prevalent it is today, right?
Yeah.
And it's
I remember when I actually had a gal on here like an episode or 2 ago, Gary Olson, and she talked about no-till, and she's this little blonde, like 23, 24-year-old girl taking over her family's farm, and she does no-till. But I remember when I first heard about no-till, I just had this picture in my mind of, you take your bag of seeds out there and just throw them out on the ground and hope for the best. I was like, literally.
Yeah. I mean, when you're drilling it in, but then, so go back to what you were saying, about ag tech, and when we talked about auto steer and GPS and all that, Well, now, you can actually be a lot more precise for your pesticides and all that stuff, right? So you're not just broadcasting it across the field. Specifically, not whether it's pesticides or fertilizer or whatever. This area here needs this amount. This area doesn't need anything. This one needs a little bit less. This one needs a little bit more. And you can be a little more precise. And that goes back to what I was talking about, the cost effectiveness, because that piece of equipment allows you to do that. Might look like a lot of money, but then when you say, okay, well, as a result, I'm buying less fertilizer or pesticide, or I've got whatever benefit money that I'm saving, all of a sudden it starts paying for itself. And those are the kinds of analysis that I think we need to see more of.
Yeah, your efficiency just goes up.
Mm-hmm.
And there is actually so much science and technology in agriculture, and I think consumers do not realize that. I think they still have that perception of the farmer with the suspenders or the bib overalls, and the wheat hanging out of his mouth. And also, I just said 30% of farmers and ranchers are women. I don't want to be sexist here, but it's that stigma. I think it's hanging on tight. It's hard to get rid of. But yeah, science and technology that is what agriculture is. And so I want to drive that point home. But so obviously you're for regenerative ag, and you talked about what sustainability looks like to you. You said that you think there needs to be more research, though. What do you mean by that?
So, I've granted, I've only kind of done a really quick scan a few times, but I would love to see more economic research on it, because there's a great book called Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown. He's actually from the Dakotas, and probably not too far. And he fell into regenerative agriculture, 30 years ago or whatever it was. And he's done very well for himself, and he's been able to improve the efficiency of his land, cut down his costs. He's diversified his operation. He even got a few folks, and they bought an old processing facility as a cooperative, made it a cooperative, so they have kill dates and everything else. My question is, how replicable is that? How scalable is that? Or was he just right place at the right time? Right, because it goes back to farmers markets and everything else. Can you make a living doing that? I mean, now granted, our entire ag system has been kind of turned into a mass production and nationwide, and then exporting the rest and everything else. So when we talk about regenerative agriculture, like I said, some things. I mean, when I say it makes sense, I mean it's going to make sense for certain people, right?
Yeah.
On some grounds, you just can't use no-till. It just doesn't work, right?
Okay, I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, I think part of it's going to be your soil type, I would think.
Yeah.
Right? Cover crops too. It depends on where you're trying to plant it, right? And when you think about, or looking at the extra cost for this machinery that allows me to do precision planting or precision application or whatever that is, what is the economic payback of that, right? Are you spending more money than you're saving? And that can also, but then you have to kind of do like a 360. Okay, because I'm using these practices, I can charge a premium for my product. Because I'm using these practices, even though I spent money on the front end, I'm saving money on the back end. And over a period of 5 years or whatever that number looks like, it actually comes to be more cost. I'm actually making that money back, right? And I'd love to see, and so if anyone listening is a ag econ professor, whether you're at Tennessee or anywhere else, give me a call, because I would love to be a part of that research project. Because, I'm not for or against it. I want to do what's right by the producer. But as an economist, I am curious about that, and maybe I'll just do it on my own. I don't know, but I would love to study that over time. Is how cost effective and how scalable is stuff like regenerative agriculture, where it's not just a one and done kind of a deal.
Sure, and well, like we said, farmers they're not going to want to spend more money than they need to. So if you can give them the numbers to show them the benefits of, maybe changing their production methods to fit the standards of what we call sustainability, yeah, maybe they might be more apt to go that route.
Right.
If there's, you got the data and numbers to support it. But let's talk about some fun topics. Okay, maybe they're not fun, but they're just maybe more controversial, and I love controversy. But when I'm not doing this, I'm reading the news on the radio. And recently, I just read an article that said, like, Beyond Beef sales are improving, actually, which doesn't make my beef heart feel very good. But so along the lines of fake meat, do you think there's hope to educate consumers the truth about the necessity for ruminants on our planet, or do you think like the wildfire of hate for beef cattle is just too far gone? Where do you think this is gonna go?
I think people are starting to push back a little bit because at some point you're like, all right, I can tell you hate this product. You hate cattle, right? And methane this and methane that. But then you've got folks out there that are studying, methane emissions of cattle, and like Frank
Mitloner.
Mitloner. Thank you. I can never say his name. It's harder than mine.
I'm a big fan.
And I read a lot of his stuff, and I want to see, and I hope there's more people out there that are, can educate the consumer. And that goes back to, people. I think part of it is being so far away from your food source that you just don't understand, how that works. And I mean, what is more carbon efficient than grasslands, right? I mean, it is a very efficient closed circuit system. More so, and I'm not picking on row crop guys, but I'm just saying, grasslands and prairies. I mean, that is a carbon sink.
Yeah.
And you look at things like these lab grown and stuff. Now, I'll actually answer that one two different ways. Number one, it's plant based, which means it's peas and stuff like that. So it is still farmers that are growing it.
Exactly.
Maybe for a different way. And on the flip side, the very same people that are saying are advocates of that, in other aspects of their life, they start talking about processed foods, and you can't get much more processed than some of these veggie burgers and all that stuff. I mean, especially when he starts talking about the food science behind it to make it taste like something else. And if you're a vegetarian because of moral or religious reasons or whatever, and you just but you need protein in your diet, I'm not going to fault you for doing stuff like that. But if you're doing it because you think that you're saving the world, but you want something that tastes exactly like a hamburger, you clearly like hamburgers. And so why not learn more about the industry, talk to a rancher, and understand how the system works, right? And rather than just, whatever is on the front page of your city, weekly or whatever, right, out in Brooklyn or wherever. I mean, it's just, I think you're right that part of it is just a lack of education. I think that's where agriculture, we've been really good at what we're doing. We have not been very good at telling our story.
Yes.
And I think that needs to change.
Yeah, and for us working in agriculture, it's really difficult to get a word in edgewise when you have consumers bombarded by the mainstream media vilifying agriculture, celebrities. I mean, it's scary to me that people just accept this misinformation from celebrities. I mean, what do they know? They just happen to be famous and have a lot of money. Just because you can act or whatever it is that you do, it doesn't qualify you to speak on behalf of really anything besides acting.
Right.
So that's very, very frustrating. And I have friends that are vegans or vegetarians, and I obviously stray away from this topic when I'm around them. But it's I know some of their reasoning for doing it, and it's misinformed, it's misled, and it's just unfortunate. And and again too, they have their emotions preyed upon, because when you're disconnected from agriculture, when you're disconnected from maybe death, when you grow up an egg, you see death every day. It's just part of the industry. So when you're so disconnected from all of that, it's very easy to anthropomorphize animals and attach human emotions to them, like Bambi. It's so, I get it. If you feel bad, I get it. That's great. It means you have a moral compass and you have a heart, but it's just misinformed. And that's the unfortunate part about it. So I don't know how to fix that exactly.
I mean, I think that goes back to what I said. I think agriculture just needs to do a better job of telling its story.
Yeah.
And that's why I love folks like Frank that are out there, you know, basically, doing the truth checks or whatever what they call them, fact checking and all that, and say, hey, look, no, actually, look, there's certain things that we could do better, but let's not just write these broad strokes. There's plenty of misinformation out there that that you don't really realize, right? And you think about how many thousands of or whatever cars and trucks and trains and everything else that are moving stuff out, right? The same people that are saying that cattle is bad for the environment are getting Amazon packages every other day.
Yeah.
Those things are being delivered on a vehicle that run on gasoline.
Mm-hmm.
Or let's talk about the electric cars. Well, you have to mine those rare earth materials to produce those batteries. And if you're mining the earth, that means you're ripping open the earth, you're harming the biodiversity of that, and you're using machines that are powered by gasoline.
Yeah. Someone said that these electric cars are like basically a giant iPad.
Right. Now, people will say that, you have to do it once and then you're good forever. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. But the point is, or you're wearing, I'm against this and I'm wearing this, fleece vest that's actually made out of petrochemicals, because that's what fleece polyester is. It's out of petrochemicals, right? And so I think a lot of that is just people don't really, they latch on to like a certain idea without actually trying to do a 360. Okay, does this actually make sense, or is it just sounds cool and trendy?
Yeah, it's definitely the cool and trendy part. So from an economic standpoint, if we stopped slaughtering beef cattle completely and no longer had the byproducts that we harvest from cattle as well, what does that world look like? Does that world even operate?
I don't want to have a nightmare tonight, so I don't want to think about a world without beef. But I love my brisket and my steaks.
Well, this is the world that people are pushing and proposing, and it's just like, you know what, guys? I don't think you've thought this through.
Well, I mean, I guess if you do that, are you going to do? I mean, are we talking just cattle? Are we talking animal livestock? Animal agriculture as a whole. So no more hogs, no more.
Let's grant their wish. No more animal egg.
Okay, so if there is no, well, then we're going to be converting a lot of grasslands, which, like I said, are great collectors of carbon, into crop land, because we have to grow, and it's not just. Not just field corn and wheat, but it's going to be soybeans and winter peas and all these specialty crops and stuff that have massive amounts of input requirements and resources, water and fertilizer and everything else, right? So all of a sudden, all those, all that rangeland and stuff like that, and especially some of that stuff that is just not well suited for crop production, there's a reason why we graze them. Yep. So now you have to have a massive amount of investment that you want to be able to recoup, and you are going to change that land completely. The biodiversity of that land is going to change completely, and you're going to have to till it more, and you're going to have to do everything else, right? So again, second and third order effects of what you're trying to do, people don't actually think about it. It sounds great in theory until you actually think about what it takes. And then, of course, they don't want to hear, well, that's not true, or, oh, you're just being a negative Nelly or whatever. No, I'm actually being realistic, and this is what it's going to take. If we're going to take, parts of our range and convert it to cropland, and you're already upset that it's happening in the rainforests of Brazil and around the Amazon. Yeah. That's what they're doing. I mean, now you're going to see more of that, and then all of a sudden you basically do more harm than good.
Yeah, and I know that that's like a very dramatic, drastic picture to paint, but I want to paint that picture because ultimately what's happening right now is people are taking inch by inch. That's the goal, isn't it? I mean, to demolish animal agriculture because people don't feel good about it. So, since you're involved in extension and educational work, do you have any suggestions or thoughts, or have you mulled this over on how producers might be able to reach out to consumers more effectively to kind of help bridge that communication gap that is just, it's big. I don't even know if we're closing in on it, but what are your thoughts?
I mean, of course we have our commodity industry groups, and if you get on Twitter, you'll have folks that hate them and you'll have folks that love them and everybody in between. And I'm just talking about folks in ag. I'm not even talking about people outside of ag, right? Yeah. And I'm not going to name any names, but I mean, there are, groups out there that get a bad rep or are absolutely adored depending on who you're talking to. Right? Yeah. And so I would love to say that we should all get on the same page, but that's just not going to happen. We all have opinions. And you know what? I think we should probably talk amongst ourselves in a more meaningful way and say, hey, look, this is what we're trying to do here. And we're, at the end of the day, we're feeding and clothing the world. So, and so I love, seeing some of these farmers markets and everything. I mean, pick your owns and stuff like that have been around for years, but people are becoming more and more, especially I think now with COVID, when people are leaving the cities and coming out into the country a little bit more and getting some fresh air. They're like, oh, okay, here's a world that I've never even seen before, but I love the space and everything else. And I think those conversations just need to continue. I don't know that we can have one big umbrella group because not everybody in agriculture agrees on everything either, right? So I just don't see how that's going to work. But I think having these conversations and continuing to ask these questions and I appreciate you getting, down to the heart of the controversial type of questions because those are the questions that need to be asked and answered and discussed, and whether we all agree in the end or not, at least we have an understanding where the other person's coming from.
Right.
And then we can take that to the world as well.
Yes. And to me, what's the point of us having a conversation if we're not going to talk about, the tricky subjects or the subjects that don't maybe have an immediate answer? I just don't see why we would avoid those topics because they are so important and we're not going to get anywhere unless we do have uncomfortable conversations.
That's right.
Well, it's just where we're at nowadays.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, so the short answer to that last question is we need to have uncomfortable conversations. Yeah. We can't shy away from it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not amongst ourselves and not with the world.
Yes. So, I mean, I don't know what all of you other farmers and ranchers are doing that might be listening, but I'm going to continue to flood my Instagram, my Twitter, my Facebook with annoying facts about cows and whatever else agriculture facts I can come up with because I know people they probably like go on my story and they're like, they just click through it because they probably know it's just all things about cows. But at least they know that and I've planted the seed. And then, and they can be like, oh, I know her. She's that annoying girl that talks about cows all the time. But that, at least they know that. And if they have questions, they know that they can come to me. And I do have people come to me, and I love it. And I love helping people and educating people because I love this industry so much. And, I talk about it all the time. Like growing up, hated it. It ruined my social life in high school, or so I thought, because... And I always talk about the one example is when we have to put bulls out on the 4th of July because Dad was just ruining my life. That's the only reason we had to put bulls out on the 4th of July. But no, it's just funny how life does a 180. But I love this industry. So with that, do you have any uplifting or positive thoughts to leave us with today, about in regards to agriculture's future?
So I would say, take a step back. I mean, there's a lot of noise out there, and it kind of goes back with that last point. We have a story to be told, and never forget what it is that we're doing. We are feeding and clothing the world.
Yeah.
Now, are there substitutes for it? Yes, to a point, right? I mean, polyester versus cotton or wool, right? And that certainly has shifted the calculus of the apparel industry. But when it comes to food, whether you're growing feed corn that is now fed to steers that are finished and sent to a restaurant, or you're producing wheat that's turned into bread that's sitting at some cafe, right? And don't forget about the folks that are growing sugar and coffee and other things around the world, right? Never forget what we're doing, and then be willing to listen to the customer. Whether they're right or wrong is a separate conversation, but at least understand where they're coming from because you can't really answer or have, you can have an opinion, but if you want to have something meaningful, get an idea of where they're coming from and say, hey, by the way, I noticed that this is what you think, but let me show you what we actually do. And I think you've got the wrong impression. Now are some people going to just, blow you off? Of course they are. I mean, that's just life.
Yeah.
Right. But we see that in our own industry. but remember what we do and why we do it, and then say, okay, if folks are, wanting or needing something or don't understand something, we can't be a closed shop anymore. I think we need to be able to have those conversations with them as well, and in some cases show them what we do.
Yes, exactly. So thank you, Chris, for coming on today and talking about these issues. I definitely want to have you back. Maybe we can find something even more controversial to talk about next time.
I would love
to. Yeah, so next week I'll be talking with Robert White. He's the Vice President of Industry Relations for the Renewable Fuels Association. So we'll be talking about ethanol, because that's a hot topic right now, and I'm really excited about that because every time I go to the gas station, I'm wondering, what is this E15 stuff? So we're going to cover those topics. Thank you again, Chris. This is the Agri-Culture Podcast, and I am Jessica Benson from the American Ag Network.